Well, the playoffs are just a fortnight away, and whether you're fighting to get in or trying to ready yourself for a final push, we've got all the best waiver wire pickups on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley, and it is the Week 13 waiver wire show. And it's kind of hard to believe that this late in the season, you can still find some good waiver wire pickups. And yet, here we are. There's no teams on bye this week, so it is all about strengthening your side for a push for the playoffs and making sure your team is as strong enough as possible for the playoffs as well. If you haven't already, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. You can ask any questions in the comments, or you can message me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. My rankings will be up soon at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and you can find my articles over at football.razzball.com. But it's time to get into the waiver ads for Week 13. And we are starting things off with the quarterbacks. And Bo Nix, he's the QB7 on the season. He was the QB7 last week. Realistically, how is he still available in your league? He's still available in a quarter of leagues, and that is crazy to me. He's got a bye in Week 14, which makes it a little bit iffy, though. So if you can't get him for Week 14, or you need cover for Week 14 because you've got a Lamar Jackson or a Jaden Daniels, for example, I also really like the idea of picking up Sam Darnold. He had a good week last week, unfortunately. In fact, he's had back-to-back good weeks in really tough matchups against the Bears and Titans. It now gets a little bit easier for him. The Cardinals isn't the greatest start, but it's okay for this week. But next week, Week 14, that is, he takes on the Falcons. And with a lot of teams on bye, he's a fantastic pickup to play for them. So if you need somebody for Week 14, maybe stash him now just so you're not fighting a whole heap of other people trying to get the best waiver pickups. Anthony Richardson, disappointing last week, but had a good week the week before. He's going to remain boom bust, but he's a solid option. New England's not the best matchup, but somebody you can stash to see if he starts getting a little bit of a roll on later in the season. And finally, Russell Wilson. I like him this week, essentially. He's more of a play for this week than anything else. Obviously struggled in the snow against Cleveland, as you would expect. But this week, he gets the Bengals. I would expect that he's going to be very solid against them. They concede the third most points against quarterbacks. So if you need someone for this week specifically, I like him more than Richardson and arguably maybe even more than Darnold for this week specifically. Running back wise, and we also what Bucky Irving did last week. In fact, realistically, going up against Carolina, even Rashad White's a valid option. You can even start Sean Thomas if you're crazy and in a really deep league. They're just going to run the ball all day. We saw what they did last week. There was a lot of run. That's going to happen against Carolina as well. So Bucky Irving's a must start, and Rashad White is a deeper option, more of a flex option than anything else. Rico Dowdle remains the starter in Dallas, and while they haven't been fantastic, he's had some solid weeks. He didn't even score, and he was still a top 20 running back last week. That was helped by having 6 teams on bye, but I think against the Giants, we would expect him to have a good week. Jalen Warren has been very solid of late. You're not going to get a lot of touchdowns out of him, but you're going to get a reasonable amount of touches in general, and especially in a PPR league, he's a solid option, but he's best as a handcuff for Najee Harris. So you can pick him up and start him if you need him, but he also gives you plenty of upside if Harris is out. Not my favorite handcuff, but if you need someone you can start that also has some upside, Warren's a solid option. And finally, 1 week filler, Jeremy McNichols against Tennessee. Not a fantastic option, but realistically, he's going to be available in pretty much every league. So if you're desperate for a running back this week because you've got injuries, Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler are probably out for Week 13. And for that reason, I'm picking up McNichols. This is kind of equivalent to last week when I suggested playing the Raiders guys. Amir Abdul was the guy to own there. In this case, we know it's McNichols. He's the guy. Chris Rodriguez will be involved as well, and he's a desperation option if you're really desperate, but McNichols is the guy for me. Couldn't even find a photo of him with a clear background. I'm not sure what's going on with that, but he is someone that you can pick up and play this week. Don't expect amazing things against Tennessee, but he's better than most of the guys that aren't actually starters in their team. Now, deeper options, Gus Edwards will probably start next week, but against Atlanta, that's a tough matchup. And I do think that we're going to see a lot of Hassan Haskins and maybe Kamani Vidal. So with J.K. Dobbins potentially out, Edwards has some upside. He's certainly someone that you can stash and see what happens, but you'd have to be pretty desperate to start him this week, but he's better than most of the guys who are kind of like in the back half of the committee. Roshan Johnson against Detroit. That is a tough matchup, but he is getting the goal line carries. He's getting the third down and 2-minute stuff. But as we saw last week, that's still not a lot of touches. You're really hoping for a touchdown. We got it last week, as I suggested, but this week, gosh, don't really want to start him if you don't want to. Got plenty of upside as a stash as well, but don't feel great about him. Trey Benson has a little bit more upside to him, but gets another tough matchup against the Vikings. He is getting plenty of touches at the moment, but they're not exactly high-value touches. James Conner's still the guy. If the Cardinals somehow win against the Vikings, then Benson should have a solid game, but I think that the Vikings are probably going to make it very tough on them. We saw the Cardinals weren't very good last week against Seattle, so I don't imagine them jumping forward much against the Vikings. So for that reason, Benson is more of a stash, but a desperation start if you need someone. And finally, Amir Abdullah against KC. This is a horrible matchup, but he is more of a receiving back type. If Alexander Mattison is out and Zamir White starts, maybe you can use Abdullah because you know he's going to get more third down work. If Madison's back and White's out, that becomes messier. I think Madison's probably the starter then. And if Madison or White are both back, there's no situation you can even think about Abdullah. I haven't gotten any clear news about those Raiders back. So Abdullah is someone you can pick up if you're looking for a potential low-end starter, especially in a PPR league. But I don't really love any of these guys. I think Edwards is the only guy you can even feel reasonable about. And if you look at how he played last game, it's not exactly great. Waiver stashes, and these are more upside guys. Allen, Algier, and Charbonnet, I talk about every week. And Coram, realistically, you just put them on your bench and you hope for an injury. That sounds wrong. I don't really want to hope for an injury. You're putting on your bench in case there's an injury. If there's an injury, then these guys are going to be league winners. We're heading to that point of the season where you kind of want these sort of guys. It's happened for plenty of players in the past. It's happened with Charbonnet. It happened with Zamir White a couple of seasons ago, last season, where he was a very good option down the stretch in those playoffs because there was an injury in front of him. Could easily happen to any of the guys in front of these guys, and that's why you're putting them on your bench. Wide receivers, and surprising that some of these guys are still available in league. Shakir obviously had a bye last week, which helps that. He takes on San Fran. It's not a great matchup, but he's still a very solid option. Darnell Mooney has had some injury issues and gets a really tough matchup against the Chargers. They're not looking as good at the moment, the Falcons, but he's still someone that you really need to have. He's the wide receiver 13, which is crazy. The fact that he's available in even a quarter of leagues is just way too much. Jacoby Myers against KC. Tends to play in the slot, but not always. That's actually the better place to play against KC, so it's not as bad a matchup as it is for most wide receivers. He was a top 10 player last week, and he's wide receiver 31 on the season. So if he's available, he's a solid pickup, especially if you're going to be in trouble in week 14. Finally, Juwan Jennings, a little bit lower for me this week. Nothing to do with last week. We expected he was going to struggle with Brandon Allen. It's just they take on Buffalo. That's going to be a really tough matchup. So he's not someone you can use at the moment. I feel like those other guys are going to be more consistently good. A little bit lower down in ownership percentage. Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman take on Denver. That's a bad matchup. Second fewest points conceded against wide receivers this season, the Broncos. I don't think you can really trust either of these guys against them. So for that reason, I'm more stashing them, and that's why they're more of a deeper option, but they have plenty of upside, especially down the stretch for the playoffs. Christian Watson finally got those starting snaps, starting to take over from Dontavian Wicks. It helped that Romeo Doubs got injured, and Wicks therefore went across and took some of his snaps, while Bo Melton was also involved. If Dobbs is out for a little while, that's really going to help Watson. But even if not, I still think Watson is ahead of Wicks. Problem is, Watson dropped that massive opportunity for a long touchdown last week. If he gets that, he's getting, 10, 12 points, and we're not really talking about this too much. But because he dropped that, he ends up putting up essentially a donut. I think he had 0.4 points or something crazy like that. So for that reason, hard to feel good about Watson. Very boom bust. Has plenty of upside any given week. And if you need upside, he is a solid option. Demario Douglas kind of goes the other way. More of a PPR option. Don't feel great about him, but he does have a bit of a flaw, especially with Drake May. Also has a bye in week 14, which isn't ideal, but you can start him against Indy because of their defense. So I'm okay with picking up Douglas, even though he's not one of my favorites. Very deep options. Elijah Moore against Denver. Basically, same thing as I said about Jeudy and Tillman. Solid guy to pick up. Don't want to start him this week unless you're desperate. Michael Wilson against Minnesota. Solid game last week, as predicted. This week gets the Vikings, which is a great matchup. So I do like his upside. I feel like he's a solid chance of producing in that matchup if you're desperate for somebody. Devon Vele obviously had a good game last week. He takes on Cleveland. They've conceded the second most points to wide receivers. That means that this is an opportunity, but he's not getting a lot of snaps. We're still seeing a lot of Humphrey and Franklin. Obviously, you've also got Cortland Sutton always involved. They're just mixing the guys up so much that it really, and Mims, of course, which makes it really hard for Vele to get enough snaps, and that really lowers his floor, but still able to put together some touches, and if he keeps playing well, they are going to give him more opportunity. So someone you can stash moving forward if you need some depth. And finally, Adonai Mitchell, he's in there on the off chance that Josh Downs is out. Not really sure what's happening with Downs. I think there is a reasonable chance that he misses this week. New England's not the greatest matchup for a wide receiver, but he is someone that you can use if you're desperate because he will go into that slot role, and that has plenty of value even with Anthony Richardson. Finally, tight ends, Taysom Hill. You probably forgot, but in week 11, he was crazy good, and then he had a bye, and everyone forgot about him. So he is still available in like half of leagues. He's got plenty of upside in any given week, but very, 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 very low floor in a given week. In a non-PPR league in particular, and even in a half PPR league, certainly has some value. PPR, a lot more risk, but especially if they've still got injuries to guys like Chris Olave, he is going to remain a solid option. Jonnu Smith has been surprisingly good the last few weeks. Very boom bust still, but those booms have been pretty big. So because of the way Tua is playing, because of the way teams are marking Tyreek Hill, I do feel like Jonnu's going to keep getting opportunities, especially around the goal line. That means even though he has a low floor, he has some high upside, and he's someone you can use. Hunter Henry, same idea, but he's more of a floor guy. He's had a solid amount of touches every week. He's a good PPR option. This isn't the greatest matchup, but it's fine. So he's someone you can start if you're desperate and struggling at tight end. And finally, Jatavion Sanders obviously had that horrible injury where he kind of landed on his head this week. Hoping he's fine, but certainly check in before waivers go through on exactly what's happening with him. At the moment, I haven't really heard any clear reports. It does seem like he's avoided any serious injury, but we don't know if he's going to miss time. My guess is possibly 1 week. And if that's the case, it's less useful owning him. But it did seem like he was getting those starting snaps over Tommy Tremble finally. He has plenty of upside, and he's one of my favorite deeper league pickups for the playoffs, and also a good pickup in Dynasty if he's still available as well. Finally, the kickers and DSTs, the guys you really should be streaming. We've been nailing these the last couple of weeks. I'm going to Chase McLaughlin this week because I always love anyone taking on Carolina, and McLaughlin's got Carolina this week. He's a pretty solid kicker. Hasn't been great the last few weeks, but Mike Evans back should definitely help. I think McLaughlin will be good. And Spencer Strader, he was one of my favored streamers last week. Ended up being the number 7 kicker. This week against Vegas. Vegas conceded the most points to kickers so far this season, so I do think that makes Strader a good option. As for DSTs, Commanders take on Tennessee. Tennessee conceded the most points to DSTs this season. That means the Commanders DST is a good option. And the Cowboys DST, the number 1 DST last season, kind of out of the blue. And now they take on the Giants with Tommy DeVito. They've conceded the 4th most points to DSTs this season. And that was with Daniel Jones. With DeVito, it's probably going to be even worse. So they are a very good DST to pick up as well. Now they've got Micah Parsons back. And that is all we've got for our waiver wire show for week 13. Nearly forgot what week it was. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It really helps us out. You can also follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down and on Twitter at at Fantasy First Down with no O. Our rankings will be out soon at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and you can also check out my articles at football.rasball.com, or you just pop your questions in the comments below, and I'll get to you as quickly as possible. Hope you've enjoyed today's show. I look forward to chatting to you guys on Thanksgiving for our Streamers and Stashes show. And then, of course, our Start Shit show will be coming up on Saturday morning as well. I will chat to you then.